Well, it's 10:02, and on December 3rd, this is our meeting of the Landmark Preservation Commission, a special meeting to talk about equity and social justice. So I'll call this meeting to order. And I think we're going to start our meeting kind of as our typical meetings go. So we'll start with introductions. Is that right, Jen? Because the public can attend this meeting. So we should go ahead and introduce ourselves. I'll get started. My name is Kelly Wemple. I'm an architect and I was nominated by the American Institute of Architects. Next, I think we've got, I don't have my list out of alphabetical order. So who's up? George, I think it's you.
Well, I'm George Dennis, and I am a fan and supporter of historic homes. I live in one. We were landmarked last year, and I was nominated by History Colorado.
Thanks. Brad's not in attendance, so Aaron.
Hi, I'm Erin Hummel. I'm a landscape architect, and I was nominated by the American Society of Landscape Architects.
Great. Graham.
I'm Graham Johnson, Preservation Project Manager, nominated by the Denver Planning Board.
Julie.
Good morning. I'm Julie Johnson. I'm Historic Preservation Project Manager, and I was nominated by the community at large.
Gary.
I'm Gary Petrie. I'm an architect, and I was nominated by the Denver Planning Board.
Erica.
I'm Erica Warzel. I'm an architectural historian and preservation consultant, nominated by the community at large.
And Anne.
Hi, I'm Anne Wattenberg. I'm an architect nominated by the American Institute of Architects.
And Jen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Excuse me, I'm Jen Capetto. I'm Landmark Preservation staff.
Great. All right. So we don't have any meeting records that we're reviewing as part of this meeting, but we are going to hold our typical public comment period. So at this time, if there's anyone joining us from the public and you'd like to make a public comment on, this would be about preservation matters in general, you can go ahead and use the raise hand button if you're joining via your computer at this time. Public comments are 2 minutes per person. If you're joining by phone, you have to dial *9 and that will go ahead and show us that you've raised your hand. So are there any public comments?
We have 2 members of the public attending, but no hands raised.
Okay, great. Then they probably just want to hear what we're going to talk about. So we'll go ahead and get started. This is a special meeting. We're not reviewing anything on consent or design review, no hearings. We just have one discussion item and it's very important. So it'll be about equity and social justice. So Jen, are you going to kick this off?
Sure, yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce you all to Dante James, who he gave the planning services staff a training a few years ago that was really phenomenal. And he is now doing a training for the LPC. The Lower Downtown Design Review Commission was yesterday, and I believe next week is a planning board meeting. So he'll be training all of our commissions and boards, and I think you guys will have a really great conversation. I'm going to turn my video off just because I participated yesterday, but I'm going to be listening. So welcome, Dante.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to come and share in this conversation with you. It is truly much appreciated. As Jen said, I've been doing work in and out of kind of the planning department in Denver for a couple of years. And I'm one of the founders of the Gemini Group, which is an organization, a consulting firm that does this work around the country with state and local governments, who have higher ed, K through 12, nonprofits, just across the board, to really help organizations understand and infuse the concepts of equity into their work, no matter whatever work they do. I've been doing this work a long time in some form or fashion. I'm a recovering attorney. But I've worked for 4 different mayors in 3 different cities, including Wellington, and so have helped to start offices of equity in different cities around the country. So it's just the work that I've been participating in for a long time. And appreciate the chance to do that in my own backyard, based in Littleton. So appreciate the chance to do this in the place that matters the most to me. I guess first, if Kelly, if you could either make me co-host or just allow me to share my screen. I do have a PowerPoint that I'm using.
I already did that, so it should be okay.
Okay, I was like, good, because I don't know how to do that.
Perfect. Thank you. I see it now. And so just kind of to start with, as I said, I've got a PowerPoint. The session is, designed to be a couple of hours long. It's typically a 4-hour session. So if I sound like I'm talking fast, that's why. I'm trying to squeeze a lot into a shorter period of time. And typically there's a lot of small group work that we do. We're not going to be able to do that on this session, but we'll provide the opportunities for, it's a small group anyway, so we'll just do it on the big picture. The conversation most specifically is around racial equity. And when I talk about race, I mean race and ethnicities of color. And the focus for that particular reason, or on that particular demographic, is for a particular reason, which is we approach it from the concept of it's called targeted universalism. That's been posited by Professor John Powell out of UC Berkeley. It essentially says that if you focus on those who are most impacted in society, you will then positively impact everyone else. But if you try to be all things to all people at all times, you end up being not much to anybody. And so our focus is on communities of color in this country, which by any social indicator of success, be it home ownership, healthcare, employment, whatever that might be, essentially the darker your skin, the harsher your outcomes. And so our focus is bringing awareness to that, but also what do you do with that? Because we can just offer you things that need to be considered all day, but if you walk out going, now what do I do? Then it's just been a failed opportunity, at least from our part. So our goal is to really provide you some thinking ways to be able to infuse this work and better understand how you can do that. The conversation is most specifically around the dominant culture and how that impacts and affects everyone else. And so in this country, the dominant culture is straight, white, Christian, able-bodied, and male. And so again, how does that dominant culture paradigm impact and affect everyone and everything not within it? And my goal is, is never to change your mind about anything. At the very least, it's hopefully the opportunity to offer different perspectives that maybe you haven't heard or been able to consider before, or been able to have a real conversation about. And so, as I said, I'm a recovering attorney, so I love a good discussion and good debate. So it's really designed to be a conversation and discussion, and hopefully it creates a safe or comfortable enough space where you feel able to engage. Most trainers will promise you a safe space, and safety looks different to everyone. So we don't promise you a safe space, because I don't even know if you like the folks that you're sitting on this commission with. So it's really about how do we create a comfortable space that allows you to feel able to engage. And I think that's it. So if you don't mind, I'm going to share the screen and we'll just get started and hope for no IT issues on a Friday morning. So here we go. So this is a conversation most specifically, again, about race and ethnicities of color, which is the hardest conversation for folks to have. We've become able to have conversations around gender, around sexual orientation, around religion, around any number of things, but race is still the hardest conversation for folks to have. And so in this conversation, for me, there's no blame in it. No sense of trying to make anybody feel guilty or shame for what is or what has been, because that doesn't benefit anybody. But really, it's about how do we recognize and take responsibility to ensure that we are making things better, or as good as they can be for everyone. And you don't work for government, but you are representatives of government because you sit on a commission. And so how does that play out in the communities that are being served that you're engaging with? And it's really about just taking the responsibility to ensure that we're doing the best we can and serving everyone in the best way possible. So what we're going to just touch on today is the root causes of racial inequities and government's complicity in their creation and maintenance. And then how do you identify them? But most importantly, what are some strategies to reduce or eliminate those disparities across all identities? Because again, by focusing on the most impacted, we can impact everyone else, and each and every one of us carry multiple identities, which often give us more opportunities to be marginalized or underserved. And so how do we begin to recognize that? And then finally, what are some approaches that are effective to reduce institutional bias? We'll talk a little bit about bias, but most of the conversation this morning is around institutional and systemic bias and racism, not one's individual. And so the institutions have bias, and they've had bias much longer than you've been alive. And so how do we recognize those? And then also, what can we do to begin to address those? And so what's up next is just a very short video that kind of describes the different types of racism and how they play out in talking about it from an institutional and systemic approach. So we'll just watch this and we'll have a conversation.
Moving the race conversation forward. You've probably noticed that when our news media talks about race, when they talk about racism, when they talk about racial justice issues, they quite often talk about it all wrong. But have you ever tried to quantify exactly how and why the media gets it wrong about race and what we can do to fix it? Well, there's a new paper published by Race Forward entitled Moving the Race Conversation Forward that sets out to do just that by compiling nearly 1,200 articles from major newspapers and cable news outlets and systematically breaking down the most common mistakes we fall into when we talk about race. And in their research, Race Forward identified 7 harmful practices, the 7 most common bad habits in media coverage of race, as well as recommended strategies to get us back on track. And I recommend reading all 7 for yourself, but right now I want to focus on just one of the biggest traps that racial justice conversations fall into, which is our tendency to focus too much on individuals instead of systems. Because when we talk about race, when we talk about racism, when we talk about racial justice, it's important to remember that there are levels to this thing. There are at least 4 different levels of racism that each need to be considered. The first level is internalized racism, which is all the prejudice, bias, and blind spots you might have within yourself as an individual. The next level after that is interpersonal racism, which is what happens when we act out that internalized racism on each other. Those 2 levels, the internalized and the interpersonal, are the 2 individual levels of racism. And those are the simplest ones to focus on, the easiest to recognize in our day-to-day lives, the ones we spend most of our time talking about, but I'm here to tell you, there's something else. Systemic racism. Once you get past those individual levels, first of all, you have to deal with institutional racism, the racist policies and discriminatory practices in schools and workplaces and government agencies that routinely produce unjust outcomes for people of color. And when you step beyond that level, you have structural racism, the unjust racist patterns and practices that play out across the institutions that make up our society. The individual and systemic levels of racism are both important, both necessary to reckon with, and they're both usually interrelated. But if you want a real, fully clear-sighted conversation on racial justice, you have to be talking about both levels. And one of the most common ways we fail to see the big picture on race is by failing to think about systemic racism, by failing to be systemically aware. In their research, Race Forward found that our media coverage far too often falls into that trap. They found that approximately 2/3 of race-focused media coverage fails to consider how systemic racism factors into the story. 2/3 of their coverage of race fails to be systemically aware. And that is a problem. When we constantly focus only on individual stories, it distorts our sense of how racism works. It encourages us to see racism only as the product of overt, intentional racist acts by individuals that can be fixed simply by shaming and correcting those individual defects. And it encourages us to see individual stories of transcending racism as proof that there is no more racism. That if we have a Black president and Oprah is a billionaire, then there must not be anything else to talk about. And any problems that other people of color still face must be due to deficiencies on their part. It must be a problem with them instead of a problem with the system. And that is no, just no. We cannot have a real thorough conversation about incarceration rates for people of color, about the thousands of families torn apart by our immigration policies, about the perennial disparities in education, housing, healthcare, employment opportunities. We cannot have real talk about any of the biggest issues that affect us all as individuals if we are not also thinking about the systems involved. We cannot have a discourse that brings us closer to racial justice without being systemically aware. So next time you listen to the news or read the news or watch the news or surf the news, you should take a minute to ask yourself, is this coverage systemically aware?
So what I want to do now is just kind of follow up on his final question, essentially is, if you look at media in the last few years, can you think of some examples of where the story revolved around race, but the focus was on the individual actors as opposed to looking more at the institutional or systemic issues around race? And enough examples just in the last couple of months, but feel free to go back a couple of years if you like.
George Floyd comes to mind right away.
Okay. Certainly there was lots of discussion as to who he was and what is his background, and was Chavez racist, and was he, all of those things, specifically looking at the two of them. I will suggest that as a result of this country watching the murder of a Black man over and over last summer, there's been a much bigger effort to address things from an institutional and systemic perspective. So you now see healthcare, mental health organizations who we have as clients, the school districts that we have as clients, different sectors have recognized the need to look at their own internal systemic or institutional approach to things. But you're absolutely right. I mean, a major component of most police interactions tend to be just about those individual actors. And George Floyd was one example, but I think it was also an epiphany for many, many folks that we need to talk about institutional and systemic issues as well. Thank you.
Dante, I thought about when we first went on lockdown with COVID, I thought about the packing plant in Greeley, where those people were sick and yet they were required to go to work. That seemed really systemic to me. That just, it really made me ill.
Yeah, and without the larger conversation of who they are and how they fit into this system of, they don't have a choice if they want to be able to feed their family. And the majority, if not all, are Spanish speaking, and how that is a whole nother conversation about immigration policy, but certainly the focus was on just those individual actors as opposed to much more systemic. How about sports? Anything come up in sports? I said Colin Kaepernick, what would you say?
I was going to mention that, but I couldn't remember his name for the moment.
Okay. So the focus was clearly on, for the most part, him taking a knee, him disrespecting the troops, him not liking this country, him disagreeing with the military. And that's never anything he ever said. He was very clear about his motivations, which had to do with police abuse of folks in the Black community. He was very clear. And so there was never really a bigger conversation around why he took a knee in the first place in trying to address those institutional and systemic issues of police abuse of folks in his community. And the NFL has, in the last 6 months or so, recognized its need to do different and better, but they've never apologized to Colin Kaepernick, and he'll still never get employed by the NFL. Anything else come to mind? About the last 2 trials that we just had recently?
Well, I guess I wonder about if Rittenhouse would have been black, he would have been dead in
Yep.
the street, rather than not only survived, but somewhat celebrated by certain aspects of our society.
I don't really think he could have walked by the police with an AR-15.
This was pointed out to me by my 11-year-old daughter, but the fact that of these 2 trials, the Ahmaud Arbery, that trial is referred to by the victim's name, and Kyle Rittenhouse is referred to by the person who actually harmed people. So I thought that was really interesting.
It's very insightful, very much so. And when you look at Arbery's trial, the jurors in that case of the city is between 25 and 35% black, as I recall. And of all of the jurors of color and black jurors that were available and interviewed, the prosecution dismissed each and every one of them except one.
It was the defense, correct?
I'm sorry, yes, the defense dismissed each and every one of them with peremptory challenges. But the judge even said that he had no doubt that the reason for releasing them was based in race, but there wasn't anything he could do about it. Which, as a defense attorney, I'd be happy to argue that. But anyway, it just reflects, again, the systemic and institutional issues within the legal system. And I could give you a whole lot more examples, having spent a bunch of time in court. I could give you a whole bunch of examples. But again, just another example of the outcomes of race in context. So great examples, thank you. So I guess you have some idea of what institutional and systemic bias and racism can look like if we actually step back to look at it, as opposed to focusing on the individuals. Because it's just much easier to focus on individuals as opposed to systems. Wow, system, how do we fix the system? We can just fix the individual. But the individual is propped up by the institutions or systems that they work for, and allowed to believe they can do what they do because of the institutions and systems that they work for. So that's kind of the big picture of that. So I'm going to share the screen and keep on going. Thank you. So just want to be very clear that in this conversation, this is not a partisan conversation. It's not a political conversation. I would suggest it's been hijacked by politics on all sides to become one, and it's used as a weapon on some level. But as we have this conversation, certainly for me, it's not a political issue, because the idea of how are we serving the communities that we are designed to serve in the best way possible, in the best way that they need to be served, should have nothing to do with politics. It's just about customer service on steroids, quite honestly. How are we doing what we do in the best way? So what's up next is the answer to the question for us, why do we need to focus on race in the first place? Let's fix poverty, because if we fix poverty, then we'll fix everything. Or let's focus on gender, because We still know women don't make what men make. But let's focus on LGBTQ because you can still be not hired or fired in many places for being gay. All of which deserve absolute attention and focus to eradicate them. That's issue. But it's our position that there's been nothing as impactful in this country, nor continues to be, as is race. And race is an absolute predictor of outcomes. And so for equity purposes, equity is concerned with outcomes, not intentions, because we've been listening to good intentions for hundreds of years. And so by focusing on the outcomes, we can better evaluate how we are really doing. So what's up next is a brief slideshow of some of the legal and legislative decisions in this country that have been based purely on race. Again, as our answer to the question, why do we need to focus on race in the first place? Because, you know, the more we talk about, the more divisive we make it. We're just creating more difficulties and problems. So we're just going to watch this and then we'll have a bigger conversation. We put this in here to demonstrate this was not just some Southern issue. Oregon was the only state admitted to the Union with an exclusion clause in its constitution that said Black people can't live nor move into the state. There were already Black folks living there, so it couldn't kick them out. So it then passed what it called the Lash Law, which just said, you can live here, we'll just whip you twice a year until you decide to leave. It wasn't removed from Oregon's constitution, nor technically legal for Black folks to move into the state until 1926. And if you don't know what a mulatto is someone who's half Black, half white. And I didn't say there's no sound to this. Yeah, maybe I did say, but there's no sound to this. And I'm guessing you know this is not a true statement. The 13th Amendment did not abolish slavery. If you read the phrasing of the amendment, the second half provides for an exception, which says you can still be made a slave as punishment for a crime, or if you're under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. I'm sure you know one of those campuses here in Colorado. And I know you can't read the article attached to this, but the article tells a story of a woman who was trying to get herself legally declared an octoroon, which would have meant she would be legally considered 1/8 Black. She was trying to do this so she could marry the Black man who she loved because it was still illegal to do that. Interestingly enough, the judge in this case was two-time Denver mayor and KKK member Ben Stapleton, who ruled against her. After the ruling, they both went out and got married, and they got arrested. So this is not a new conversation that somebody in planning or anywhere else dreamed up, that we have a good idea, a good conversation around race, just because it sounds like a good idea. We've been talking about race in this country since before it was a country. Laws, discriminatory laws based on race, racism was built into the fabric of this country, brick by brick, law by law, legislation by legislation. And if we're going to undo it, we need to undo it in the same specific, targeted, focused, strategic, unapologetic way, or else we're just going to continue to play hopscotch one issue at a time. And so what we would typically do now is put you in a small group to have a conversation. So we'll just do it here. To have a conversation around this question: what was new, surprising, or impactful to you about what you just saw? What was new, surprising, or impactful to you? And or a question about it, something that you saw that maybe I can provide some context to. But what is it that maybe impacted you or just surprised you in what you saw? So I'll just pause and see what you might be able to say.
I'll jump in. I think one of the things that I was embarrassingly probably not so aware of, certainly before being part of the Landmarks Commission, was the history of redlining in different neighborhoods in Denver, and seeing that that was also held up in court. And one of the slides that you shared, is again a systemic way here that I just had no awareness of prior to, even with an architectural history background or anything like that. And I think that's come up in several of the landmark designation and applications that we've looked at, and is certainly part of a number of our districts. But that is so deeply ingrained that way that it's still surprising to me every time I see that example.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. I mean, so many people just assume that, the quote unquote ghettos sprang up because that's where everybody wanted to live, which is not true, because that's the only place folks could live. I mean, Chinatown exists because there was only the place for them to live, or Japantown, or, you pick it, because there was no opportunity to live elsewhere. Or even if there was, that redlining, as you described, kept folks from being able to obtain a loan to buy a home and live anywhere that they wanted to. So between zoning, between redlining, all restrictive covenants, you see where people end up living because there was no choice.
Well, just like to add to that I think it's important to recognize too that that's had an impact to today, in my understanding of it, and that people who were redlined, the Black community, weren't able to build equity and kind of middle-class wealth that the white folks could, and that they couldn't then pass that on to their children through their real estate wealth that they were able to accumulate. So I think that's important to know too, that it's still going on today in its legacy.
No, appreciate that. I mean, one's home is typically the number one way of wealth building, and passing that along generationally is what has built wealth in many communities. And so even after World War II, the GI Bill was in existence and Black folks could not partake of it. So that opportunity to build wealth began essentially for the middle class in suburbia, I'm sure, as you know, after World War II. And what was the name of the first, it escapes me, Levittown, okay, was essentially the first development built after World War II for the purposes of, let's move away and move into our own development, neighborhoods, suburbs, all of those things. But people of color couldn't participate at all in that wealth building opportunity. And the opportunity then for generational wealth building was restricted. Thank you, Eric.
I also didn't know, I mean, when you brought up the war, it made me think of those slides that you had brought up, that like a former veteran was not able to obtain citizenship because of his, mixed race background. And I didn't know about those specific instances. And like people have said, a lot of this redlining is kind of newer information to me. I mean, not new today, but learned about it in the recent past couple of years. And another thing that I always find to be so shocking, and you had pointed it out and kind of paused on the slide, when, when slavery ended, you could still, if you broke the law, you could still become a slave. And, so like all of these things that you know, you think like this is progress, but then there's all these exceptions that are still making it so, I don't know, creating these inequities and letting them persist even under the veil of improvement.
Right. No, thank you. And to your point, your first point anyway, Singh Tin was Indian. And by racial classification, quote unquote, which has no scientific basis in fact. There is no science behind race. It is a legal and social construct. And you saw the decision around Singh Tin. The context is in 1922, the year before that, Takao Ozawa, who was born in Japan and came to this country and became an attorney and took his own case to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, you can't become a citizen because you're not Caucasian. So the next year when Singh Tin, who was by racial classification considered Caucasian as an Indian, the Supreme Court had screwed itself. So when you read the decision, it twists itself in knots to describe how you may be Caucasian, but because of your religion, your hairstyle, your way of speaking, your way of dress, no one walking down the street would ever consider you culturally white. Therefore, you still cannot become a citizen. And that remained the law of this land until the mid-50s, that you could not become a naturalized citizen if you were not white.
That also shows the, in the Oregon example, there's always a political workaround as far as doing the right thing and doing the thing that is wanted to be done by the powers that be. Even if it's totally inane, people swallow it.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. You know, I describe systems, be they biological or otherwise, as designed to defend themselves. And so when you see these types of laws and legislation, it's typically as a result of something. And the system is defending itself to maintain itself in the way that it is. And so people always talk about the system's broken. It's not broken at all. The systems are working exactly as they were designed to benefit the folks who designed it. And so how do we recognize that and begin to dismantle those outcomes in those systems? Anything else new or surprising or surprised about Colorado?
Well, I'm always not so surprised because I'm kind of a historian, but this wasn't that long ago. I mean, and that's what's really shocking to most of the really young people that I work with at my office. They think it's ancient history. And I'm like, you know, Black women didn't get, you know, they couldn't vote. I mean, and it's fairly recent. I forget the year they were granted the vote, but it's not that long ago. I mean, it's kind of shocking. And so I don't know how this stuff is taught in school, but it definitely needs a revisit on how it's taught.
Mm-hmm. No, to your point, it's not really a history lesson because some of it is so recent. I mean, it hasn't been that long since you could have your own credit card. So it's not just a history lesson. And more specifically, people know their own history. I mean, Latinos know their history, Black folks know our history, Indigenous know their history. I mean, I know folks who were in Indian boarding schools, if you know what those were, and they still cry when they talk about it. And they have a real hard time trusting public education. And the last school run by this federal government that was kidnapping kids from reservations closed in Utah in 1985. I know Japanese folks who had family members incarcerated in those camps. I know Latinos who can tell you they got suspended for speaking Spanish in school. My father died before he could legally take his white wife to Arkansas to visit his Black family. So it's real and personal and visceral to so many of the folks who you may be engaging with or the communities that you are designed to serve. And so in the big picture, why is knowing any of this really important besides just to make us more knowledgeable as a person? Because the communities that you may deal with there's a built-in trust deficit that you had nothing to do with. But that doesn't mean it's not impacting. That doesn't mean they don't trust you as representatives of government. Because the idea of just saying, trust me because I'm from the government, clearly doesn't work. And so how do you recognize that there may be a built-in trust deficit right off the bat from folks who are trying to engage with you, from communities that typically have been marginalized by government because they know their history? And so how does that begin to be considered in the work that you do and the engagements that you have? And or how do you try to hear from communities that you typically don't? And I know that's not necessarily your job, maybe that's the staff job, but how are you trying to ensure that that is in fact happening? Is that any consideration at all? And so all of this plays into having an understanding of history, and to, I think, Kelly or Julie's point, you don't learn this in school, not much of it anyway. And you may learn some of it, but the question is, what is the context by which it is presented? Because we could talk about, manifest destiny and westward ho all day and how great it was for this country. But if we're not talking about genocide, we're not having a real conversation. And can you imagine every time someone who's indigenous picks up a $20 bill and sees a picture of the man whose nickname was Indian Killer, who wanted them erased from this country? What do you do with that? How does that even gain recognition, let alone empathy and understanding for the impact that that has on folks, as an example?
One of the things that I struggle with a bit from the perspective of being on the Landmark Preservation Commission is it has to do with, let's take 5 points as an example. There are a handful of places, maybe more than a handful of places that represented, they were like key places in the history of that community when it was highly segregated. The dispatch office for the Ritz Cab Company, for example, still exists. There's a garage there right around the corner that was the only service station that Black Americans could go to get their car fixed during those times.
Mhm.
And those places are potentially threatened by development. But the question then becomes, is the landmarking of those places to kind of preserve their place in history, does it have the effect of denying the ownership of those places? I think in some cases there's still Black ownership, the ability to take advantage of receiving the wealth that development could occur. So there's kind of like history versus, preserving history versus interfering with the accumulation of wealth of a minority landowner. How does that get resolved? Because if the place goes away, in a way the history goes away, but on the other hand, somebody is sacrificing something for the common good, and it's somebody who's probably made more than enough sacrifices already. It's not some wealthy white guy that owns property. It's a family that has struggled to achieve what they've achieved. And not that a case specific like that has come up to the commission. Well, one sort of did with the house in Northern Park Hill that was owned by a Black family, that there was an attempt to landmark it because it was a very early house and it had an association with some agriculture. But I guess that's a struggle for us. How do we kind of balance those kind of questions?
And that's a great question. It's probably an ultimate question in the work that you do, because I would also suggest on the flip side that happens with white dominated communities that want to designate themselves or designate some aspect of their communities to keep it the way it looks, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And so again, on balance, what do you do with that? And so I'm not sure I have a great answer for you, but context matters. And how do you hear from those communities that may be most impacted is really a question around equity. How are you hearing from those who may be most impacted? And what is the consideration of the context? And I'm not trying to give you an answer necessarily, but all of these, I think, are the considerations and the questions that you have to begin to ask yourself, to the point. Because it's just, I mean, equity is a critical thinking exercise. It's just one of my favorite quotes is, organizations move in the direction of the questions they ask. And so what are those questions, and how do you interrogate not only your decision making, but the ordinances and the foundation of where your decisions come from in the first place? And so I'm probably not answering your question, Gary, but I would suggest that it is a difficult question.
I didn't think there was an easy answer. I'm just saying that's this thing that I personally kind of struggle with as I see the changes to the 5 points area, and also understand how important it is to understanding our own history as a city, that some of those places remain.
Mhm.
And it's a dilemma.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, I live like a block from the action, and it's heartbreaking to me because I see all those little houses that made up the 5 Points neighborhood. I mean, those families lived there, and then a lot of cases they had their businesses in the front and their homes in the back, and a bunch of them are coming down, and it's the same thing that Gary said. I mean, it's it's a chance for these families to pass on wealth.
mhm.
And yet I also hear from part of the community that it's being gentrified and it's no longer what it used to be. And then they look at me, since I'm on the commission, you're allowing it to gentrify. And I'm like, I got the guidelines. We can only talk about contributing buildings. These are the contributing buildings. And so, yeah, Gary's right. We're in a rock and a hard place, and I'm heartbroken.
Mhm. No, I appreciate that. And I also appreciate you continuing to call it 5 Points, as opposed to its new name, which I just don't even say. So I appreciate that. I used to have an office down in 5 Points, right across from Sheila and Carl's building. So I know exactly where you're talking about.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I love the neighborhood. The growth is hard for me, but.
Right.
I think that this
That is the issue, isn't it? Meets the requirements. And there are times, we're forced into a decision that doesn't feel right, but checks all the boxes. So we got to change some boxes, I guess.
Well, I thought
Stretch them, make them a few ovals.
I thought that the effort with the designation of La Alma Lincoln Park was actually a great direction, because I thought, and I say the landmark staff really did a great job, because I think everyone learned a lot from what happened with 5 Points. And the La Alma Lincoln Park is a really creative effort to try and save a working class neighborhood and keep those homes, keep the fabric of the neighborhood and allow people to live in it. And I was really proud of what we had to do. But in the public hearing, which was lots of people spoke, it was a dagger to the heart when someone said, well, all you white people are making these decisions. And, it's really hard to know what to say, because we're a volunteer group, and I know that every time a spot has come up on the commission, Janice tried really hard to find minority people, minority professionals who want to serve on this. And I think that this is another side of the problem, is that it's just hard to find people to serve on a volunteer, pretty time-consuming organization to keep that going. But of course, that would be a tremendous help when you're talking about how do you change institutions. We're doing our best, but when they said we're all white, what can you say? We're all white. It's true. But like I said, I I'm very proud of that work because I think there were definitely some issues that happened with 5 points. I actually just want to make one more small point about the issues of covenants. So I've only been in Denver for about 15 years. And when I moved here, one of the covenants that was held in, one of the housing covenants held in Denver for a long time was against Jews. And so I met people not much older than me who moved to Denver when they were younger and couldn't buy a house, except in very specific neighborhoods. But in that case, a sort of interesting thing happened to those communities, because when I met people who grew up in those communities, a lot of those communities were they took a slightly different direction. I'm just pulling this out there for nothing because I think there's a lot of thought in it, that those actually became very tight-knit communities because everybody had to live together in the same place. And in some ways, I'm sure there's some people who feel that once those covenants were lifted and people moved out to the suburbs and sort of moved around the cities, that actually something was lost. And I'm not saying that covenants are a good thing or redlining is a good thing, but I also remember that house Gary was talking about, the doctor. And I remember everyone talking about when he bought that house on Sundays, everybody after church, they said there were only 2 churches. There were only 2 African-American churches, and everybody from that church came and picnicked in that area. And I remember the 2 people who spoke and talked about what a strong community it was. And so I'm not saying any of this is any good, but I do think that there were some community building things that happened when some of these communities, when people lived close together.
Oh, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. I think you're absolutely right that that level of close-knit community existed. One, for on some level, self-preservation. But I mean, everybody was close to each other. There's no question. I mean, I could make an argument that integration was one of the worst things that happened to the Black community. So, you know, I mean, I understand your point. It's more a question of, am I excluded from many other options because government said I can't do X, Y, or Z, versus, you know, we live here because we enjoy being in community. So that's a great point.
Yeah, and I think you brought up so many good points, and I agree that I really think that the La Alma Lincoln Park district was a great step in the right direction, and that I appreciate Landmark staff has done so much to, like, in our recent updates of designation criteria, to include cultural significance and really open that up, because I think previously we were really not incorporating that into weighing into our decisions of what gets designated and not. So I think that was a huge step in the right direction. And the creation of, like, the district's own guidelines to make it more equitable and make it easier for homeowners to make more economical improvements to their homes without us, you know, having to say, hey, that doesn't meet the guidelines. You know, there's a little bit more flexibility there. So I think that was all a really great step in the right direction. And that kind of addresses what George was mentioning, where, you know, sometimes we're handcuffed by the guidelines and we can't really make decisions outside of that because our body doesn't, I mean, we can't weigh, you know, have subjective opinion tainting our view on these decisions because it's just not fair to applicants. So I think, to George's point, that, you know, if we're checking boxes, maybe the boxes need to be changed. And I think that this Landmark staff has done a really good job of trying to do that. And they did that by updating the designation criteria. And now we're working on updating the guidelines. And so hopefully we can keep that in mind as we look at updating the guidelines moving forward.
No, that's a great point. And we had some conversation about that yesterday, and I've got a couple slides around some of the language that are in the ordinance. And maybe finally on this piece, to the point about, you know, you're an all-white body. Okay, that's not your quote unquote fault. There are, you know, reasons, and I know Jennifer and I have talked briefly about the idea of trying or how to get more diversity on just commissions broadly. But then, if this is the makeup, right, how do you have any relationships with architects and other folks of color that you could reach out to or engage with as an ad hoc subcommittee of something as you're addressing La Alma, as you're addressing 5 Points, as you're addressing issues related to the Asian community, to the indigenous community? If there's no relationship, then you continue to still work in a vacuum of who you are. Not that you, quote unquote, are bad, but how do you enlarge the scope of who you have that can influence and engage in some of your work? It doesn't require them to spend all the hours that you so wonderfully give, but they could still be engaged and offer input and thoughts and influence in how you are considering your decision-making processes. Just as a thought, just as a thought.
Yeah, and Jen, I'd love to, I mean, if there's any way to do that, it's so tough because I think, and I don't see any city attorneys on the call right now, but you know, we're told, I mean, we can't talk about these projects we review in advance to one another because we all have to come to our meetings like with our own, you know, opinion on things. So we're told not to discuss these things outside of our commission meetings. So I don't even know how to approach something like that, but I think it's a great idea.
The irony I see about that is that as a quasi judicial body, we're almost held to stricter standards than the US Supreme Court, because obviously they talk amongst themselves when they're trying to consider something. You know,
but also receive an amicus brief, a friend of the court, that they can have other information besides those who are the parties to the case. So there's other ways you can still do this.
Yeah, you know, I wonder about how, because not only this commission, but preservation in general it's white, it's more affluent maybe than average. How we gain the trust of minorities that have a trust issue with that aspect? And I'm thinking of a particular case. A number of years ago, I met with people at the Macedonia Baptist Church on Martin Luther King Boulevard, and that's a historic place. It was central to civil rights activities in the 60s. And there was an effort by some folks at History Colorado to get it designated. And I think there's as I understand it, the resistance to designation has to do with trust issues. Is that right, Erica?
It was listed in the National Register with the
okay
congregation.
Okay, I guess I was thinking in terms of local designation, although local designation carries some restrictions that might not be acceptable. But I knew that your predecessor at History Colorado has some difficulty winning that trust to get building designated.
Yeah, I think it was definitely a continuing conversation with the congregation and pastor about, you know, and in the end, it was easier to say National Register, you know, doesn't place restrictions on you, but can bring to light this important history that you have. So it was an easier thing to help build that relationship with them because of that. Whereas I think City of Denver has a harder path just because of the way the local ordinance does have restrictions.
Jennifer, did you want to chime in?
I've been listening and smiling and nodding, and you know, you guys can't see me, but I've been really engaged by this conversation, and you all have brought up a lot of great points. So I was going to chime in about what to do about building relationships outside. That's one of the things that we as staff try to do is we're slowly but surely working on building relationships. And I know you guys can't necessarily go talk to architects or other, you know, community members about specific projects, but we can, and we can we can build that. So so it's something that we build into our work, or try to build in when we can, or where it's appropriate. So.
Thank you.
And I think when you said, that's something as commissioners we can't do, I mean, I understand it, but it is kind of hard because that kind of gets back to that issue of trust. It's like if we're not, it almost seems like we're not actively trying to improve that. And so that I think can come off in a negative perception, but it's not that we don't want to be involved in those conversations, but that we can't. And I think another thing that kind of resonated with me that you brought up, Dante, earlier was at the very beginning, you were talking about targeted universalism, and that if you're trying to make everything completely fair for everyone, maybe it's not really fair because these people are already starting here. We're not starting at the same plane. And so I think that that's something that is difficult when we're trying to apply our guidelines to everyone the same way. And we never talk about, we can't take cost into our decision making or anything else. And so I think that sometimes can make things a little bit unfair as well.
Okay.
Well, that's the difference between equality and equity.
Yep, and you're giving me my segue to the next section. So
Perfect.
if you don't mind, I'm going to keep on going. Just I love this conversation, so thank you so much. So going into where Gary was going to take us, what is equity? There's lots of definitions and descriptions, and the city has its own version, I know. But for us, this is simply our definition of equity. That equity is achieved when one's identity cannot predict the outcome. And as I said before, equity is about outcomes, not intentions. And also this doesn't take into consideration opportunity or access, which both are absolutely important to achieving changed outcomes. But you can provide me the opportunity to access your program, your grant, your whatever this might be. But if the internal workings and processes and regulations are still biased, my outcome may never change. So for us, it's about evaluating those outcomes. And to the point about the difference between equality and equity, there's nothing wrong with equality, but you don't treat your friends, your family, your clients, your colleagues equally, because they all need something different from you to best achieve in your engagement with them. And so the idea of equity, certainly as it relates to the work that you do and the folks you serve, is about how are we ensuring that we are providing the resources for success in an equitable way. And the resources could be time, could be money, could be technical support or assistance that staff provides to folks who have no clue how to navigate your processes, whatever that might be, in how we allocate or reallocate those resources to ensure that everyone has that best opportunity. And if the fence, to your point, are the ordinances and regulations that you are working with, or it's a law, you're not going to change that fence tomorrow. It's not going to disappear. But again, how can we maybe shrink it? How can we make it see-through by providing those best resources so folks can have the opportunity to achieve that success? And so the real goal is to start with equity, not start with equality and have to do something different. And I always describe policies that treat everyone equally as lazy policymaking, because you don't have to take a look at what we need to do differently for this community, or, I mean, we have to treat sometimes the disability community differently than we treat the able-bodied community for a reason, right? Otherwise, everything is the same and people can't access things in the same way. Does everything go out in English? Or or if so, we're treating everyone equally, but obviously we're not really considering who can't read English in the best way to avail themselves of our messages. So how do we do equity in trying to make sure folks can see and understand what it is that we're doing? So a different picture with the same idea is based on size or ability, right? All the bike shares and scooters and car shares that are downtown now, not everybody can avail themselves of those. And certainly sometimes geography is a proxy for race, because you're not going to find these things out in Swansea or Elyria or in Green Valley Ranch. There's no bike and scooters out there. So often we can see equity just based on geography sometimes. So we can, give everyone shoes, or everyone a pair of shoes that fit. So how do we really consider the idea of equity in what we're doing? And this is not a diversity conversation, to somebody's point, I think it was, because you can have diversity all day and never change an outcome if the functioning and internal workings of the organization or the system don't change. Diversity by itself doesn't make a difference. I mean, we got Black and brown cops all over the place, but the system and the institution of policing hasn't changed, and the culture hasn't changed. So all the cops that I know who are of color essentially just keep their head down so they can make sure they have backup when they need it, and they don't want to be considered the problem child, so they can continue to get promoted. So you can, again, have diversity all day and never change an outcome. So the difference between equity and equality. There's nothing wrong with equality, but it won't get you to necessarily equity. And we've done this training with all the Supreme Court justices in this state and the Court of Appeals judges. And so you can imagine the conversation when they want to stand on the 14th Amendment. And my answer is the majority of all the slideshow that you saw was what they saw, and most of that discrimination happened after the 14th Amendment. So we can have it, but what do we do with it? So switching gears now, going to conversation around something else, we're going to give you a little counting test and see how well you do. So math test coming up.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 13.
Yep. Okay.
But did you see the moonwalking bear?
So how many saw it the first time? I saw Kelly's face. I know she didn't see it. So it's just, we just use it as a kind of a funny video that demonstrates just what it says, that we often miss what we're not looking for, which segues into our conversation around bias, right? We all have bias. Each and every one of us have bias, and there's nothing wrong with having bias. The real question is, do we know our biases, and do we know how they may impact and affect our decision-making processes? But bias simply is just the tendency to favor or favor, in this context, or disfavor, how we evaluate one group or its members in relation to another. The hard part about the conversation around implicit bias is that often the biases that we hold don't necessarily reflect who we say we are or what we will outwardly, explicitly endorse. We don't discriminate. We love everyone, but I'm not sitting next to that person on the bus, but I didn't think about it. I just veered myself away because I don't want to sit next to that person on the train, right? We would never say that's who we are. But again, sometimes how we act and what we think we believe about ourselves don't necessarily work together. So there's two brains that work all the time. The unconscious brain is processing and collecting 11 million bits of information per second. It's working at lightning speed and taking into consideration all the things you're not aware of, right? What's out the corner of your eye, what's under your left hand right now, that sound you heard, all of those things, those thoughts running through the back of your brain after what you're going to do when you get off of this call, all that's going on. While the conscious brain is processing 40 bits of information. So it's that deliberate speed of these 40 bits so that we can focus and concentrate on those things that need our absolute deliberate attention. So that means that the majority of the decisions we make are governed by our unconscious brain, as in 99% of the decisions we make that we're not thinking about are governed by our unconscious brain. And so there's dozens and dozens and dozens of types of bias, and we're just going to run through just a couple that are maybe relevant to some of the work that you do, or just as you walk around the world. So affinity bias is that birds of a feather flock together. You know, you meet somebody and you just had a connection. You just felt something was going on. Maybe because they enjoy the same things that you do. They like the same sports. They like the same programming. They look like your cousin. They grew up in a similar kind of town or environment. They have the same degree that you do. All of those things provide some sense of affinity. But then how does that affinity, which often provides for that benefit of the doubt, because, well, they must know this or must think this way because I do, and we have that connection because we both went to the same college. We have the same degree, so I know they know this, even though they've never said that at all to you. That benefit of doubt or assumptions that you have based on those affinity biases. And you see these in recruitment and hiring and other kinds of ways like that. The next one is just confirmation bias. It is not normal to seek out information that does not confirm what you already believe. We don't search out information that contradicts what we believe already. It's just not what we typically do. And then you'll see this in evaluation processes. If you are evaluating something or some, an architectural firm or organization, community organization that continuously comes to you, you've seen them numerous times and they bring you phenomenal work. That presentation is just on the money all the time. You're going to see less errors. You're going to find less things that are problematic because you already assume that they've got it that they have it all together. In contrary, or in the opposite of that, when there are those organizations or firms that come to you and they've always had some challenging presentations, you've always found challenges or mistakes in their work, or the staff does, right? You begin to see those, you're going to find more errors because you expect to see them in the first place. So you're going to be looking for them and you will in fact find them. So that's how that confirmation bias can play out in this context. So would love to hear from you just for a moment. Where do you see the possibility of either one of these biases impacting the work that you do? How might confirmation bias or affinity bias play into the work that the commission does, or that you just maybe see as you do what you do?
I guess I'd like to just jump in and say that it both struck me as kind of our natural human tendency to be lazy and to kind of assume to not have to think as hard maybe as we need to. And so especially when we have, so many projects to review for each meeting, I could definitely see probably, especially the confirmation bias of just being familiar with either a certain applicant's work or even the neighborhood that's being represented, or that's the district that the subject property is in. I could just see a kind of expectation of seeing either certain problems or seeing certain solutions that are acceptable in this context, but maybe not in others. And I say that I feel like I'm kind of putting myself out there. I don't want to do that, and I try very hard not to, but I think it's a real possibility.
No, thank you for sharing that.
I agree with you, Erica. And I think the affinity bias could also be the fact that, staff puts together their report of their opinion and findings, and, maybe you typically find that you agree with a certain staff member most of the time. And so maybe you're thinking, when you're reviewing, like, oh yeah, I'm gonna agree with so-and-so because I normally agree with them, and maybe not looking at things more closely or critically to catch another perspective of the project.
I think even our system speaks maybe a little bit to, the ordinance and the guidelines that are our basis. It's not every historic district, like Erica said, which part of town, which neighborhood, that has a secondary design guideline. Country Club comes to mind, because we always have to look at those projects under two lenses, which by virtue of two lenses requires a little bit more time, I think both on behalf of staff, but on commission as well. And those are generally agreeable lenses, in their black and white text. But it is interesting how certain parts of the city, even just within the system that we all have to function in, have already been given, whether that's preference or just more thought, and I think you could draw a line through many of those neighborhoods, Alma Lincoln Park being the exception here recently, where, generally folks that have more time and disposable income and interest and ability to apply that have been able to affect differences that have become written into our process. And that's not something we control, but it's definitely something that is not equal or, inequitable here among different parts of town. And it's just part of our framework.
Yeah, no, good example. Thank you.
I think that's a good point, Graham. And I think something kind of that you just mentioned triggered like a thought in my mind, that we have applicants who are architects, we have applicants who are contractors, we have applicants who are just homeowners, who are just trying to make an improvement without hiring professional help or specialized professional help. And I think that can be tough too for us, because we're reviewing applications that look very different. What an architect's office will put together is very different than what a homeowner would sketch out. And I think that makes it hard to be equitable in, like, it's harder for a homeowner to understand how to put together these materials than it is than a professional, if I'm making sense. And so it can be hard to review those applications apples to apples when you're receiving different quality drawings, for instance. And so you might be finding more errors in one, but it's maybe not fair to say like that they have to have the same type of deliverable that a architect's office would put together, for instance.
Yep.
Or even just the language that we expect to hear, right? Like preservation, certain terms are kind of maybe frowned upon, at least those of us who are hardcore preservationists rather than, people who have expertise in the building field, but maybe not preservation itself. But yeah, I think even just the language that we hear it's important to try to keep that in mind, of like, just because someone knows a buzzword or the jargon that we're used to doesn't necessarily mean that what they're proposing is sympathetic, and vice versa.
Yep. Great.
And I think also in deliberation, there seems to be a push for consensus. Why? We keep discussing things until we all come to a spot where we think there is consensus, and basically it should be, has everyone said their piece? Okay, let's vote. And do it that way, because I think affinity plays in, well, I'm going to be a team player, and even though I absolutely love this design, I'm going to vote for it. So there's the affinity thing. So we have to maintain some independence.
That's a good point, George. And I'd love to hear if other people feel that way too, because as the chair, I'm guessing you think I'm pushing for consensus. And normally I am trying to get us to consensus because I feel it's in the applicant's best interest, because if we have a motion that doesn't pass, they have to apply again, and it's lengthy process. And if we all disagree, I often feel that the applicant has a hard time, like, how does staff give them direction to get a project that'll pass? So for me, consensus seems very important, although I don't think everyone has to agree. I do think it's important that we find something to get the applicant to have a
good
project.
point. Yeah. Maybe we should say, is there anything left unsaid? And then leave it at that. So,
Do your decisions allow for a dissenting opinion?
Oh, sure.
I couldn't hear you. What was that?
Well, I just said the decisions allow for a dissenting written opinion.
Yeah.
Okay.
But since there's 9 of us in total, one person's not here today, we have to have 5 votes to pass a motion. 5 and so even if there's only 6 of us at the meeting, we need 5 votes to pass the motion. So say we're not reaching consensus and there's 7 of us at the meeting or whatever, and we're kind of split 50-50 or 3 and 4, then that motion won't pass. And if it doesn't pass, it's automatically denied. And then the applicant has to come back, and you have to submit your materials a month before each commission meeting. So it's a lengthy process for the applicant if they get denied, and it's more time and money. So
those are great examples, and also examples of the burden to applicants. Right, that's really what we're talking about, is the burden to applicants.
I sort of think that we always are slightly fighting the image that preservation is very elitist, and that it's something that is really mostly, I mean, that there's a certain public perception that it's really something just to preserve the value of property, which actually isn't the case at all. And I think that one of the reasons that, to me, that we like to be unanimous is because people also think not only is it elitist, but it's also kind of subjective. You know, I like this, I don't like this, that's beautiful, it's not, and it's not. We try really hard to stick to the guidelines. And so I think it's a stronger case if we're, and it's not that anybody's strong-armed into it, but also I think one of the issues we have is cost is not part of our purview. And so we see that almost, the majority of the denials we see, to me, are people who just went ahead and did something because they didn't understand the process. And now they're looking to us and we have to say, no, actually you have to remove all of those vinyl windows because it's not in the guidelines. And we don't have any, that's the guideline. That's what we have to do. And I think that fights, that sort of leads into this sort of idea of elitism at a certain level, but those are the guidelines. And I'm not sure that the guidelines have to change, in my opinion, because if that is a lower quality, I mean, we're preservation, that's what we're supposed to be doing. It's much more of a maybe rethinking of the image to me than it is of rethinking the guidelines, because I think that is what preservation is. And we've seen these, and it's heartbreaking. We see people who we know have limited means, who've done something, and there's nothing we can do about it. And on a certain level, there's nothing I don't think that we should be doing about it, because we're always worried that once we open the floodgates, people with more means are going to actually test us out. It's not just going to be the person who did it accidentally. It's going to be the developer or somebody who puts an extra story on the house and then comes back and says, whoops. And then we're in the situation of their being able to say, well, you actually allowed such and such to happen. And I think that that's always puts us in kind of a hard position. And that's one of the reasons why I'm grateful that we're unanimous so much of the time, because all of us from very different backgrounds have come to the decision that this is the way to move forward.
Yeah, I appreciate the preservationist mindset. I guess I would ask, in no critical kind of way, how are people, community members, made aware of the expectations and requirements in their home to do what they do or at the building. Now, how does the city, this isn't you, how does the city inform? How does the city, through neighborhood associations and other ways, because neighborhood associations don't represent a good chunk of the neighborhood, quite honestly. So how are those folks being informed so that they're not being so detrimentally impacted financially in other ways because you're going to reject them, because you have no choice based on the guidelines you have to follow. So it's a chicken and egg. How do you inform folks so that they can come to you in the best prepared way? How can the city make sure that they are providing as much information as possible? And folks will slip through the cracks, but what is that proactive effort so that you see less and less of those? And maybe one final comment that's maybe an aside. Somebody had mentioned, city attorneys, there's no city attorney on the call. As many departments as I've run around this country, city attorneys don't make policy. City attorneys don't give you a final decision, or they shouldn't think they do. They give you an opinion. It's a legal opinion. And more often than not, it's an extremely conservative opinion. And so because they're all risk averse, I'm speaking broadly and generally, if anybody else is an attorney or is a city attorney on the call. But city attorneys' offices generally tend to be risk averse. And so as opposed to only listening to them tell you why you can't do this, sometimes the question is, you tell me how I can. And I've said to the city attorneys representing my office a couple of times, this is what I'm going to do. You figure out how to defend it. And so, how do you let them help you brainstorm how to do something differently, as opposed to just tell you what you shouldn't be able to do. And I'll stop my soliloquy on the city attorney. So I'm going to share the screen and keep on going. Jennifer will yell at me later, probably. Keep on going. So I'm going to skip a couple of these slides because I want to get to the next piece. Some of the impacts of institutional or systemic bias. Many we've talked about. Looking at the National Register of Historic Places, only 2% nationwide represent the experience of Black folk. And I would suggest that it's probably very much the same for Latinos, less for Indigenous, but you see the outcomes in this regard nationally. These are the guidelines, the language in your ordinances and guidelines. Culture. I was surprised that culture represents not just structures and businesses and institutions, but events, arts, and crafts. So how are you considering the totality of what culture can mean? And I'm not suggesting you don't. Again, I'm just asking questions. So how is the totality of culture considered in the evaluations and the decisions and the processes that are utilized by the various commissions? And then when you look at historic context, what does that again mean? Referring to cultural, right? And so how do we really represent what history is as we consider some of these questions? And looking at Denver specifically, from a conference that was held in Denver this year, only 2 to 3% of landmark properties are considered diverse. And Jennifer, I'll let you offer your thoughts from yesterday on that particular percentage and how that may change if you're there and have a moment.
Yeah, so what I mentioned to Dante yesterday and to the LDDRC is that this number didn't reflect the new ordinance language because we didn't have any designations at that point that reflected cultural significance. So La Alma Lincoln Park and Smith's Chapel are the two that have come through to you all so far that are considered diverse based on cultural significance. And, it, as you all know, it takes a long time to get these going, but it's something that we're working on. We're trying through our historic context series, we're trying to engage with communities that have not been engaged in preservation in the past or have been skeptical of preservation in the past. And so trying to trying to increase that knowledge and on our end of significance, but also increase the knowledge on all of Denverites' end of the importance of preservation and the tools that are available. Erica? Yeah.
I just wanted to add that, so in my experience with designating properties with the National Register, there's also a lot of hidden histories in properties that are already designated because they're being recognized for, say, their architecture, but they're not telling the full story of those places that actually have connections to people of color or women, or, you know, and I think it seems to me that it would be a great way to kind of revisit some of our already designated districts as well, to kind of gain a new perspective that hopes to tell the fuller story of them.
Yeah, it's something that we've been talking about quite a bit over the last year and a half. You know, West High School is a prime example. West High School is designated for its historic significance and educational significance, geographic, I think. It doesn't talk at all about the Chicano blowout that, you know, that happened in, I'm going to flub the year, so I'm not going to say it. But it's important to tell the full story of our landmarks. And so we are looking at that. In 2022, we have plans to do a deeper dive. We have an intern right now who is doing a kind of a shallow dive to help us figure out some things. But we are hoping to do a deeper dive in 2022. So stay tuned.
So, and we also talked a little bit about exclusionary zoning, how that impacts, what that does, what that means, how it certainly impacts communities of color, low income communities, etc. And then when you look at some of those specific outcomes, depending upon zoning, you see less home ownership by Black and Latino residents. And I'll say this as an aside, somebody mentioned language. Language is important in building trust and relationships. So when cities and state governments tend to talk about serving all their citizens or having the citizen advisory committee, I understand we can talk about being a citizen of the world, but citizen usually carries a very specific connotation. And so when you talk about serving citizens of Denver, there's a whole lot of folks who are not going to see themselves in that word or in that work because they are not technically, quote unquote, legal citizens of the city or the state or the country, right? And so how does the language become more inclusive so folks can see themselves in the work and see themselves being served by the government that's supposed to be serving them, as opposed to only serving citizens? Therefore, I'm someone at a loss and feeling excluded in that process. You know, the community advisory committee versus the citizens advisory, all of those types of examples that so often exclude folks in those processes. Kelly?
Yeah, so what would be a good term then to use? Because I could see what you're saying about the term citizen. Would resident be better? Like what do you recommend?
Resident, community member, something along those lines.
We don't use citizen at all for that reason.
Okay, thanks.
But even just in, I mean, if you're having conversations, you know, at your meetings, how are you describing and talking about folks? So I know the city doesn't necessarily use it. I will tell you, we were doing some work, you know, just a tiny bit of work with Public Works and looking at some of their documents, and one of their, I want to say one of their grants, something that they put out on a regular basis, still described and used the phrase illegal alien. And the response was, well, we haven't looked at these in years. Okay, but you're still putting them out and using them. Start looking at them. And so how do you you know, it takes, you have to do your own work to look internally at what we do, what we say, how we say it, and what those impacts may be. So again, just language, just as an aside. And then I think I alluded to the idea of coded language, right? Those dog whistles, right? Well, think about the people who live here, or well, we want to represent or maintain the character and flavor of our neighborhood, or we don't really need all that crowding. This is an upscale neighborhood, so we, you know, we don't, they won't say, well, we don't want those people here, but that's what that means. Or this is why I left XYZ neighborhood. All of those things, just listening to some of that coded language that certainly speaks to a particular philosophy of folks. So, you know, we can throw out examples and issues and all day, but so what do we do? What do we begin to do? As for our own personal bias, there's all kinds of examples of what you can do for your personal bias. But we simply say this: have the second thought, because you are going to have your first thought based on whatever bias you have, whatever stereotype maybe you have, whatever kids' books you used to read when you were 6. All of those things inform and continue to propagate our biases, as well as media, which is huge. But having the second thought that maybe asks you where that first dumbass thought came from, then is it just because of the conversation I had with my crazy uncle at the Thanksgiving dinner table, the TV show I watched 2 weeks ago? Is there any factual basis for me having that first thought, for that first thought at all? Because if you don't have the second thought, then your first thought rules the day. As it relates to organizations and institutions, you know, doing this, raising the collective awareness about bias, racism, et cetera, and their impacts and effects. Then how do we begin to evaluate our everyday decisions so that they can be as unbiased as possible? And then, you know, we have to do this work courageously and unapologetically, because as soon as you start this work, you're going to get pushback about why do we need to focus on race? Let's just focus on the ordinance. Let's just focus on the requirements. Let's just focus on X, Y, Z. Why do we need to focus on race? So you have to do this work courageously and unapologetically to really work to create a culture shift of how we can make this conversation more normalized. And that's the hardest part, normalizing this conversation. We can, you know, talk about, again, the LGBTQ is a much more comfortable, easier conversation to have now than it was 20 years ago. We can talk about any number of things. We can talk about, you know, the dominance of being right-handed in this country. If you're left-handed, you know what that means. And nobody bats an eye. But as soon as we have a conversation about race, oh my God, what does that do? And so how do we begin to normalize the ability to have these conversations? And just question. There's no accusation in a question. How might this impact communities of color is not an accusation of racism or you are a racist. It's just, do we know how well we're doing? What's the baseline? Because if we don't have a baseline, we have no idea where we might need to go or what we might need to do different. How do we, talking about the terms historic, right? How do we reevaluate what history means? Right? Is history only from 100 years plus? What is history? To Jen's point about West High School, that was, I think, late 70s, right? There's historic importance to community just in West High School and what happened in high school, in West High School from those students. So how do we reevaluate really what historic means? How do we create that pipeline for diversity in preservation? We can describe it as it's upper class, white majority all day, but what are we trying to do to create a different pipeline to create more diversity? You know, we can do paid fellowships and internships. I think Jen mentioned they have an intern. Doing a free internship is its own sense of classism on some level, because there's a whole bunch of folks who can't participate in a free, unpaid anything. And so how do we look at that differently?
I couldn't as a student, and so I refuse to do unpaid internships.
Yep. Students are one thing, thank you. But usually the summer intern is kind of the conversation I'm speaking. And then this is from San Francisco. San Francisco put out a resolution very specifically addressing race and the history of race in San Francisco, and the history of racism and discrimination in historic preservation policies. And so it's a much, much, much longer resolution with pages and pages of whereases. But if you wanted to take a look at it, the info for that is on the bottom. But they specifically targeted their history and specifically identified strategies to begin to address how to address that history. So what does success look like? You know, just having a common understanding and a common language around this work. Begin to evaluate policies, practices, taking a look at them. And then there's a shift in culture and climate about, you know, how do we normalize this conversation? And then you will begin to see changes in the designations and the representations of so many of the cultures that are in and around Denver, and you know what Jen described around that evaluation of the language and what some of the terminology means. We'll begin to make those changed outcomes. So finally, an equity lens is kind of the buzzword of the day, but it's just a critical thinking exercise with a series of questions. And we've seen them that are, you know, 20 pages with dozens of questions that nobody's going to do, versus some very direct few questions that you can start with for any project, program, practice, whatever that might be. So the first one is simply similar to having the second thought. What are the assumptions underlying this program, policy, practice, procedure, whatever that might be? Why do we think this is the best way to do this? Or maybe why aren't we going to do this because? And again, are those assumptions? What are the facts supporting our assumptions? How might this XYZ burden, in this context, specifically communities of color? But again, if you think back to our definition of equity, where one's identity can't predict the outcome, you can plug any identity in this that you want to determine the outcomes. How might this burden, you know, the disability community? How might this burden the Muslim community? So just being able to substitute and ask the question. And then most importantly, for government anyway, how do we involve the most impacted in the decision-making process? And this is the hardest thing for government to do across the board, because government knows how to do it because they're government. And this is what my degree's in. This is what my work is. I know what's best for the community. But you haven't heard from the community. They don't really want bike lanes and bioswales down their streets. They need something else. And so how do you hear from the folks who are going to be most impacted by those decisions? And then finally, what are some strategies to reduce or eliminate whatever negative impacts that you identify? And there's no data question in here, but you can't answer these questions really without knowing some of the baseline data. And I know Jennifer's working hard to accumulate that data, but data is just so important, as well as some of those stories from communities. We often get stuck on data without giving credit to some of the anecdotal messages from communities or from people that maybe don't necessarily become that quantifiable piece of data, but it's just so important to hear from perspectives of folks. So we've had city council, school board members, others put these on coffee mugs and set them on their desk before them so that they can use these as they evaluate what they're doing. So we just suggest, this is just, you know, a very baseline set of questions that should lead you to a whole lot more questions. But as a starting place, we offer you these 4 questions just to kind of evaluate what you do. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, is content, and I always wanted to try to leave a few minutes just to get thoughts, questions, challenges, disagreements, but just to see if there's any kind of discussion or thought partnering that might be helpful in this context. A lot of information squeezed together in 2 hours, I know. So a lot to hope and process as you go about your day, but offer the space for thoughts or questions.
I don't have any additional questions, but I did just want to say thank you so much. That was really helpful. And I know we talked a lot, so you had to skip over a couple slides. Sorry about that, but
Okay.
I thought it was very helpful.
Thank you. And I truly appreciate all the engagement and the questions and you know, further kind of descriptions and challenges of your work. that's how you make change, right? What are those questions about your work and how it happens?
I really enjoyed the conversations that you all had, and I've listened the entire time. It's been really fantastic to hear what the concerns are of this commission versus the LEDRC, different but overlapping concerns, which is great.
So maybe I'll just ask you, what do you see as the biggest challenge to doing equity work?
I think part of it is that we're, reframing the conversation from inside of pretty rigid framework, like we talked about, at least to the point that it's gotten us today. And these ordinance or guideline changes that are moving and keeping this perspective is an important thing, I think, as we look at future changes and hopefully, come back in whatever ways, big or small, we can in our little corner of the small preservation pond we all swim in. But it is important to have that bigger perspective we've talked about, I think.
I think one of our challenges is going to be earning the trust of the communities of color. And, we are swimming against a pretty heavy current of people thinking that historic preservation is just for white people and it's elite, and it's not at all. And so I think that's one of our biggest challenges, is gaining the trust of a variety of communities.
Yeah, and
I think authentically engaging them, communities of color, and not just as a box to check of like, hey, we talked to these people.
Exactly.
So
Gary's,
can I ask a question? As you used Laoma as an example, were all of your, well, you probably all on Zoom at that point, right? But have you ever done, gone out into a community and done your meetings, at the rec center, so that people can see the meetings and put a face and a sense of who you are and what you do to the work you do? Or is it always everybody's got to come down to the web building and participate?
So staff has definitely gone out and done meetings in, not necessarily, well, some in rec centers, mostly in libraries. And we try to, pre-COVID, we were trying to do more of that for sure. In terms of the meetings, part of it is that we have to have, it's logistical issues, but it's also security issues, where previously we've had some threats. And so being in an area that has a security system is important, as terrible as that is. So.
And I think also by the volume of projects we review, we normally don't have a meeting where it's just, let's talk about La Alma, Lincoln Park. It's, we've got projects, people from neighborhoods all over the city in one meeting. And so if we go to one area, then is it exclusionary to others? I don't know.
I wonder though, kind of along those lines, even thinking of today's world of living on Zoom, having meetings on Zoom, and maybe it's too late to do this, but for like our design guidelines, or maybe Jen, you can speak to this more, of not just having listening sessions across the city, but like reaching out to certain neighborhoods and not just through the associations, because as Dante points out, that's a select group of people, pre-selected themselves for that group. I just wonder, obviously that's a lot more work, but I just wonder if there's a way to more actively engage that way by geography or something.
And, churches, mosques, temples are always an easy kind of starting point, right? The Interfaith Alliance is there, across faiths, the ministerial alliances, the Black ministers. I mean, so there's just different ways to think about community engagement which I absolutely distinguish from outreach, because outreach tends to be a one-way street versus community engagement and relationship building. And so different ways, and recognizing that puts more requirements and expectations on staff. But again, thinking outside the box, I guess, is my bigger point. How do you think outside the box to begin to engage if you really want to build trust? And trust comes from understanding at a very basic point. If folks don't really understand the work of the commission and maybe some of your constraints, which they have no understanding of, how do you begin to create that level of understanding on some level of what you can and can't do currently, or what they can or can't influence? Information is power, and so how do you begin to share that?
I've been quiet through most of this, but it's been great. And one thing I keep coming back to is I do personally think preservation is somewhat elitist because of who writes the design guidelines. And again, for the most part, it's white, wealthy people with a certain lens of background writing the design guidelines. And this kind of comes back to, Dante, one of the slides you're showing that has to do with zoning and density, is then when we're reviewing additions or ADUs and we're talking about compatibility and scale, that is a lens of our kind of like white single family approach, that I think there is still a lot of subjectiveness to reviewing the design guidelines and how those can be interpreted. That if we had a broader audience of people who are giving input on design guidelines, they might be like, yeah, it's okay that the ADU is twice as big as the original dwelling because it impacts it this way. And it's kind of looking at preservation in a different sense of expanding people's view of what community is. That I do think our design guidelines are somewhat elitist because it's coming from the white perspective.
Well, and I was reading something where the statement was made about architectural style. And the statement was that all architectural styles are exclusionary.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true. I mean, even though architectural styles are used to define buildings that are designated, you know, and to speak to what you just said, Aaron, I have a bias about large additions to large houses in wealthy areas.
Mm-hmm.
And even though the addition might meet the guidelines, it's like, why does someone have to add 1,000 square feet, a 3,000 square foot house for a family of 4?
Mm-hmm.
And it's an acknowledged bias. So I'm much more apt to allow for a large ADU in a middle class neighborhood than a extremely well designed
Mm-hmm.
in a wealthy neighborhood.
No, I agree, because I think there's been some where there's very small, modest houses that had a fairly large addition that we have denied because the scale of the addition, but it made for a realistic family size to inhabit that house, like a couple with 2 children that needed another bedroom. And I just think there's some things that is inherently discriminatory in how preservation frames its design guidelines, that we can't look outside of the way things are right now.
Well, but I think another challenge is in middle class neighborhoods where the houses tend to be modest and people buy in and want to make a large addition. The struggle I have is that basically is taking a house that's making it less affordable in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So as neighborhoods that were once affordable get bought by a certain demographic and updated and added onto, it changes those neighborhoods into being less affordable. So there's that kind of
That's true as well.
problem as well. But I don't disagree that preservation has a tendency to be elitist because it is such a specialty.
Sounds like I get to leave you in a quagmire.
Yeah, I was feeling much better before this.
Sorry I said anything.
No, it was important. It's
That's
very valid.
exactly-
Thank you.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of conversation that needs to be had. I would suggest in stepping into this conversation, because as Aaron is describing, what is the default thought process? The default is kind of whiteness being the default for how we evaluate, review what we do. And so how do we step out of that? And that's not exclusive to white folks defaulting to whiteness, because we all walk around in the world. And so how do we step out of that box to recognize our own cultural box that we are putting ourselves in based on what that default typically looks like? And so I would suggest that's a great conversation to have, a challenging conversation to have. But I'm sure Jennifer can take you through that very smoothly. But those are the kind of conversations that begin the deeper aspects of this work. So I appreciate you raising that. Thank you. So thank you so much for this great conversation. Jennifer said y'all would be talkative, and she was quite right. So. I appreciate that.
She's typically not wrong.
Okay. And so hopefully at the very least it's thought-provoking and gives you some things to consider from a different perspective. And I wish you much success as you step into this journey or continue this journey wherever you are. But it's important work because it's up to government, I would argue, to really best serve everyone in the way they need to be best served. So I appreciate what you do and the time, effort, and energy that you do it, because I know how much time, effort, and energy it does take. So I thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Have a great rest of your day.
And I know we're over time. Jen, is there a time where we can continue this conversation?
Sure, but I don't know when. So TBD, let's talk about it. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Dante. Thanks, everyone.
I'll close the meeting. Thanks.
All right. See
Thanks.
y'all.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Have a great weekend.
You too.